So, why compassion? Because I'd love to understand what you mean by compassion and why now.
So, the definition of compassion, we all have an instinctive response to the word compassion, but the definition that we use is one that was developed by psychologists to describe a motivation that is innate to every human. And the definition is an empathetic concern for the suffering of another coupled with action. So it isn't just seeing suffering in the world and responding to it or being concerned or distressed by it. It's actually a motivation. It's about taking action to do something about it. And that motivation is present in all humans from toddler age, 18 months to 2 years. We first see it. A toddler will reach out to another toddler in distress and even offer them their own precious toy to try and soothe
Mm,
their distress. And then what happens after that depends on what sort of culture we find
yeah.
ourselves in. Why now is because we have seen this systematic erosion of compassion from the public space and from government. And the result is untold suffering and suffering that could be alleviated if action was taken. Suffering's inevitable in life. We all know that. You don't need to be a Buddhist to understand the nature of the inevitability of suffering as a human, but a lot of the suffering we experience isn't actually necessary. It's caused by action or omission. So we're interested in what governments and what institutions and what society can do to alleviate that portion of suffering that is not
Mm.
inevitable.
Let's just take UK as a focal point now. What do you mean by suffering as it relates to politics?
What I mean is that we have governments of all persuasions who pass legislation knowing that it will cause harm to the most vulnerable in society. So we had a raft of pieces of legislation and policies enacted over the last 14 years that did things like took benefits away from a mother that had more than two children to try and discourage overbreeding, as if that were a thing, a measure that obliged anyone living in social housing who had a spare bedroom to pay tax on that bedroom, even though they may have someone who needed caring and a carer was staying there. So we implemented these rules. And what happened was that destitution rates increased, poverty rates increased, particularly amongst children. And there we can even link an increase in premature deaths to the time that these measures were introduced. And everyone warned the government that this would happen. And those were introduced under the previous administration. This administration has come in and has not removed them. So then we have the same lack of compassion in an omission rather than commission, not removing this benefit despite its avowed
Mm,
intention to
yeah.
be there for the people. So we see we see a failure in action to do the blindingly obvious to prevent the most vulnerable in society from having to suffer even
Yeah.
greater hardship.
I don't know about you, but when I use a word like trust, there's a whole bunch of work I need to do before that conversation becomes meaningful. And what I mean by that is people have perceptions of what trust may mean. So if I say, let's close distance between you and I through the building of trust so we can edge closer to what matters most. Because if there's a condition of distrust between us, we're not going to journey anywhere together, or it's very unlikely. The reason I bring that up is I can imagine it's similar for the word, not for the meaning, etc., but for the word compassion. When you put up your hand and you put compassion and politics in the same sentence, I'm sure it's met with a lot of misunderstanding. Has that been part of your experience?
Yes, when we started, it was met with a lot of cynicism. Oh, nice idea. That's a joke, isn't it? Um, but that's often an instinctive defense to something that's longed for. And what we found after we got started was that a lot of politicians really responded to it and really, really wanted to engage with it because I've been around politics in the UK for nearly 40 years, and I very rarely met a politician, irrespective of what they then go on to do, who wasn't motivated to enter politics with a desire to try and make things a little bit better. I mean, there are a whole lot of reasons why that may, in fact, lead them to doing the opposite. But that innate intent is there, and the more we can connect with that innate intent and come back to into alignment with what we really think matters, the more likely we are to get those policies that alleviate human suffering. But to your point about the word compassion carries a lot of baggage. It has religious connotations. It's in fact mentioned in every religion numerous times. It sounds do goody, it sounds churchy. People think they know what it means, but they don't necessarily know what it means. There can be antipathy towards it, particularly we find in the left of the Labour movement in the UK, this idea of being nice to people when don't we understand there's a class war going on and you're naive to think that compassion is possible, which of course isn't true because it takes huge, huge courage to live and act with compassion, to stand up to the bully, to walk in the opposite direction when everyone else is rushing for the easy fix. So yeah, it comes with a lot of baggage, and we often have to do a lot of work to overcome that baggage before we can talk about what it
Mm,
really means. But nevertheless, there isn't a word that really embodies what we're talking about in the same way. So
yeah.
we use that word.
So, in other words, you're full of contradiction. And what I mean by that is, you know, again, from an outsider's point of view, barrister, right? Journalist, political reformer, serious author, right? That also has connotation. But why is it that someone with that kind of background chooses the word compassion, given the difficulties uh, as you've just described them?
Because the, the word isn't just a word, it has a meaning, and the capacity and the motivation for compassion could completely transform how we all live. Politics is about choices, and at the moment, we have politicians in many countries who have become
Mm,
unanchored from their moral compass. And compassion is the magnetic north to reset that moral compass. What is the purpose of politics? Why be a politician? What governs the choices we make when in positions of political power? And if we embed compassion at the center of that,
mm,
numerous things happen. It's a framework for decision making that leads to a much better society and a much better community. And there has been, traditionally a shying away from words like compassion. And I'm sure you may find the same thing with trust, because it politics is a very patriarchal space, as
mm,
is the media. And words that have emotional connotations are often dismissed as not hard enough and not serious enough for the political space. But I just use the metaphor of how women have traditionally over the years been dismissed as nice to have around, but we don't want them in the room when the
mm.
hard decisions are made. And we know now that the opposite is true. And it's the same with compassion. If you have compassion firmly at the center of your decision making, you will deliver a politics that resonates with everyone and genuinely makes the
Mm.
lives of all better.
To use the word longing. So when someone clicks with regards to the meaning and the practical implications of compassion, it reminds them of what they were longing for in the first place, irrespective of the cynicism and skepticism you might have been treated with when you walked in the room. But when you're in the room and you so eloquently, and eloquence perhaps has nothing to do with it, right? With your conviction, um, your core conviction as a human being, you describe what compassion is. It reminds someone of their longing, and that someone is a politician. What do politicians long for?
Politicians are humans, and we all long for the same thing. We don't necessarily know. We often have mistaken longings that stand in for what we truly long for. If you think about how many of us live, we long for material betterment, we long for success, but what lies beneath that longing is a truer longing, which is for inner alignment, living in accordance with a set of values that are true. And most of us in our daily lives live out of kilter with those inner values that we grew up with. And politicians are no
Mm,
different. We are encouraged, we live in our homes with a set of values, how we care for those we love in our innermost circle. We make sure that everyone has enough to get by. We don't throw our grandparent out if they become economically unproductive. We don't spend with abandon, not worrying about the next generation and what they will have. So most of us live with these values. And yet when we leave our front doors, we are invited by the culture and the extreme neoliberal society within which we find ourselves. That this isn't an anti-capitalist comment, it's a comment about how far down the road we have gone as humans away from what matters most. So we leave our front door and we are invited to live in a hyper competitive, hyper aggressive manner, which actually is in conflict with our inner knowing. And no more is that true than in the political space, which is highly adversarial, which is binary, winner takes all. That certainly the Westminster model that we have so kindly exported across the world, is predicated on the notion of conflict. The benches set up in the House of Commons are deliberately two swords lengths apart to prevent physical fights, and it's tribal. And the tribalism is encouraged, it's inculcated. Loyalty to your political party is prized more highly than loyalty to your own inner moral code. You'll be thrown out of a party or suspended if you speak on issues that the party has asked you not to speak on. And so culturally, politicians are constantly in conflict between their own inner moral knowing and how they behave. And there are genuine moral conflicts which all of us live with on a daily basis that are really exacerbated in the political space. If I want to make a difference, then I need to keep quiet about X, Y, and Z. If I want to make a difference, then I have to make this pact or moderate what I'm calling for or forget this call. And then by the time we've got to the position of power, we've shifted so far away from what we know to be right, it's difficult to get back. And so part of what we offer is an affirmation of what most politicians want to do, which is to speak freely in accordance with their own inner morality and their own inner conscience.
When I think about how you describe Westminster, which is been the way of Westminster that's been in some respects exported around the world, I think also of the world of work, where we have this word called strategy, right? If we just take a closer look at it, we notice that strategy has its origins, broadly speaking, uh, in two streams of thought. One is, of course, the art of war, which we've all heard about and it's referred to so many times as, the archetypical first book of strategy. And the second, of course, is industrialization, right? Where a group of people working in the same direction were reduced to a mechanism, and it was about efficiency, so on and so forth. And you had the invention of the organization and the way it looks. So strategy today implicitly has been adopted as a warring machine, uh, and it comes with so much embedded in it without actually realizing it.
And you're so right, because, the world of work has been designed around us as foot soldiers, ready to go,
Yes.
over the edge. And it doesn't serve any of us. It doesn't serve any of us. And it doesn't serve men. It doesn't serve women. It doesn't serve society. We've modeled work and labor in such an inhumane way. And all of it needs to be re-envisaged. And we have these moments in history that we can take. We had the moment when the computer was first invented, and there was talk about how work was going to be shared out and we'd all have more leisure time. That didn't happen. All that happened was that some people ended up working 24/7 and others ended up with nothing. And now we're at another inflection point with the invention of AI and what that can do for the world of work. And we have the same opportunity. Can we use this extraordinary and powerful in all directions innovation to reimagine how it is that we create what we need to create to enable all of us to thrive? Or are we just going to use it to further exacerbate the inequalities that already cause so
Hmm.
much suffering?
I couldn't agree with you more. That's a whole different, wonderful conversation to have. What do we do in a world where most of what we hedge our value on is taken from us? as an outsider looking in, there's an angelic quality, right, about this person who pitches up and says it's about compassion, articulates it so well with such deep conviction, and in doing so, seems almost unattainable, right? It's their thing. They were born with it. They have it. Let them run with it. What I would like to know is how you ended up as you. Okay. So has it just been the water that you've been swimming in your entire life? Or has there been an arc? Was there a moment early in life? Or did you enter the world of work as a hard-nosed politician or a hard-nosed writer or journalist, and then there was something that helped with the arc in your life? How is it that you've ended up being a person who is championing compassion?
Well, Well, I just want to correct you because I'm far from a saintly person. I'm very forceful. I really push things. I don't take any hostages. I'm not a particularly nice person to work with. I am a work in progress, as we all are. And compassion is fierce. Compassion is. I will come to the personal thing, but I just want to correct this impression of what compassion is. Compassion is really fierce. Compassion is about believing in the true equality of every human. And that means that you have to disagree. You have to stand up in a room full of people who want to call you naive or think that what you're talking about is uneconomically viable. So compassion isn't about, oh, this is a nice feeling, kumbaya. Compassion is about activism. It's about being a warrior for a world that is possible, that is currently being denied to all of us. So it's about activism. I've stood on many front lines. I've led many protests, and I've also, as you said, been engaged in some pretty hyper competitive and hyper aggressive ways of working. And I absolutely, bought into that as a means to an end. And I think what has changed for me, what everything I've done has been connected by the same set of values and my concern for avoidable human suffering, social justice, human rights, however you want to frame it, as a lawyer, as a journalist, as a writer, as an activist, as a campaigner, as a thinker. So that has been the thread. They've just been different levers which I've pulled at different moments to try and affect change. But there definitely was a point when I came to the end of my journalistic career when I really had to reflect, and the way that I was working was not sustainable. I was doing everything I could, persuading people to tell their stories on national television so that I could try and achieve political change, but at the same time knowing that that might not be in their best interest, that the light would shine on them and then the caravan would move on and I would be obliged to move on with it. And I increasingly, certainly as the media became more about entertainment and less about information provision, as the increased commercialization of the media space came in, I was overriding my own moral compass and behaving in ways that were expedient for my ultimate aims, but were not okay. And it became completely unsustainable to me. I completely burnt out. And I had to go back to the beginning. I was unable to work, I was hospitalized. Everything was taken from me. I went from being on television with, an audience of 10 million, being able to say what I thought every day, which was an incredible privilege, despite the complexity I've just described, to being medically unable to work, a single mother with two children, having to rebuild myself from the inside out. I would very, very, quickly established an outer self, but I had not worked on what lay within, and I had to begin that very messy and uncomfortable business. And I spent nearly 10 years living on, a very modest pension, just about getting by, and really working out, you know, how I was as a human and how I could try and live in alignment, still make change, but without acting in ways that caused harm. My goal now, if I can, is to try and drive change in ways that doesn't inadvertently cause harm in the
Hmm.
process.
What was the what was the catalyst? To a question like this, there are always a number of different answers. But if you could discuss some of the things that catalyzed you in the direction of compassion specifically. So I'm sure there are many threads, but what comes to mind when someone asks you, how is it that you came to think about compassion in particular?
Um, I think I think for me, it was about working out how to synthesize we all have many different selves. We have, the bit that's interested or performs in one space, then we have the introspective bit. It was, how did I unify my whole self? How did I unify my political self, my sensitive self, my creative self, my emotion emotionally damaged self, my spiritual self? How did I bring them all together, and what were the things that mattered most? And the things, ultimately, when everything is taken away from you, which is the experience I had after I became ill, it came down to love. That's all there is. Beginning and end is love. And love for me, accompanying that process of unraveling was the loss of a marriage, a difficult divorce, all sorts of invitations, if you like, to fight, and many of which I accepted, and ultimately realized that the only way psychologically I could survive this process and come out of it and rebuild myself was through the practice of
Mm,
unconditional love, which just means compassion, really, and empathetic concern, knowing that those who harm me are also suffering, that I need to protect myself and take care of myself. But if I live in judgment and if I live in resentment, it will ultimately poison me. Resentment is like drinking poison, they say, and wondering why the other person doesn't die. So 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 for me, I didn't learn these in a nice esoteric, oh, here's an interesting book, or I heard an interesting talk. I learnt this because I had to survive, and I was, on the edge of not surviving. So that's how I learnt this stuff. I had to go back to the very core of what is essential, and so that's how I came
mm,
to it, and then I wrote a book about it, and that book was really about the book that I wrote with the actor Gillian Anderson, which is called We. It's about how to transition from the me focused way of living to a we focused way of
mm.
living, which actually brings emotional resilience and all the things that we want. And that's a very practical guide, which is, the things I had to learn. How do we deal with ego? How do we deal with fear? How do we deal with resentment? How do we deal with all of these constant invitations to self abandon? And that the ego convinces us are necessary for our own survival, whereas in fact, they make our survival much harder and much more complicated. So I did that work, and then I looked at our political space, and I thought that in many ways, what we see manifested outside ourselves is exactly the same inner conflict we have between greed and balance, between aggression and passivity, and that if we could rebalance our political space so that everyone had enough, so that we weren't all in a state of fight or flight. What we have at the moment is a collective state of fight or flight where people can't afford to think by and large of each other because they're so petrified and anxious about their own individual survival or the survival of their family unit or their clan. And what we need to do is to down regulate it so that there's increased psychological safety. And what we know from biology and from neuroscience is that if we step out of that fight or flight, if we have enough psychological security to step out of fight or flight, we then become capable of having effect
Yeah.
on who we truly are. So the political space is triggered. Politicians are constantly operating in a state of fight or flight, which means that the system doesn't allow them the space that ideally they should have to collaborate, to compromise, to say, you know what, we're going to try this, and if it doesn't work, we'll try something else. None of those things are possible in our hyper, you know, adrenalized way of doing things. So, how do we shift dialogue? How do we shift parliamentary systems? How do we reform political systems that are historic, do not fit purpose to deal with our complex, interlocking existential crises. If Parliament was a business, it would have gone
Yeah.
past ages ago. We need to bring in the functionality that has been evolved in many other areas of life into the political space, so that the business of government can actually be done efficiently and with much better
Yeah.
positive impact.
With regards to fight or flight, I just couldn't agree more. You know, often when I talk about trust, I say trust changes everything, right? And then the question is, well, why? Well, the thing is, it changes the way we perceive each other. It changes the way we think about each other, and it changes, therefore, our actions, the way we act in the world. And the way in which it does that is it shifts us from one part of the brain to the other, which is a very fleshy, biological thing. If you can get trust into the room and the psychological and the neurological picture changes, then you're absolutely right. You shift from fight or flight to somewhere else. And I frame it like this. Um, it changes, it transforms the notion of strategy as war to strategy and flourishing, because it enables you literally to see in a new way, not in some esoteric, ethereal, but literally you're able to see the other in new ways. You're able to see ideas in new ways and connections in new ways. So it goes from efficiency and protection and domination to creativity, flourishing and resilience, which is just a beautiful thing.
So beautiful. I just want to say that I so love that. And it's absolutely identical. You're using the framework of trust. We use the
Yes.
framework of compassion. We're both trying to do it's the shift. We call it the compassion shift. You may call it the trust shift. And trust is really integral to the work that we do. And I love the way that you're working. We have a huge democratic issue right now, which is the loss of trust. Only 1% of under 35s believe that what a politician say is true. And so a lot of the work of compassion in politics is about trust. And we have created this piece of legislation that is now being adopted by the Welsh government, and we are hoping that other governments will adopt it. And it is a measure to sanction politicians and candidates who deliberately deceive the public. We're not talking about political flourishes of statement or rhetoric. We are talking about politicians who deliberately set out and knowingly deceive, and yet are able to profit from that
Mm,
deception, that abuse of
mm,
trust, if you like, to achieve political office. And this measure is designed specifically to try and rebuild trust between politicians and the public, because when it's enacted, the public will know that if that politician is lying,
oh,
there will be a sanction that they can get enacted, and that politician will be disqualified from office. And at the moment, we have a political class that is not obliged to live by the same rules that govern most of the rest of us in our
yeah.
daily activities.
Right. In the last few moments we have, you have used the following language, and you can play this interview back to see whether or not I'm being truthful. You've used the word self a lot. You have also used the phrase what matters most. And it reminds me why I'm speaking to you and why you've perhaps graciously accepted. The banner here is closing distance. Okay. Conversations about trust and um, how it gets us closer or shifts us closer to what matters most. So when I think about myself, and thank you so much for sharing so openly earlier. When I think about myself, my core is about closing distance, and it's trust that can close distance between where I am now and my true self. Closing distance involves distance between me and you, the other, and also closing distance between myself and what matters most. And it may be a capital M for some. Okay. So it's about closing distance in those, broadly speaking, three senses. At each stage, there is something one trusts at each one of those stages. So here I am, but I want to be something else. What is it that I trust about that something else that causes me to move in that direction? Here I am, and there is the other. What what's the basis of my trust to reach out to that other? And then, of course, um, in terms of what matters most. Here we are. We could be that. What do I trust in order to be that? What is it about that I trust? So bringing it down to you, and hopefully I've made this somewhat clear, is what is it that you trusted when you were rebuilding yourself over that 10-year period? What is it that you looked at and went, aha, the former me, zero point 0.1, didn't perhaps work perfectly, and I'm on zero point 0.2, iteration zero point 0.2. I trust this as a firmer foundation for me. What was it that you were trusting in that moment of reconstituting yourself?
There's so many. That's a wonderful question. There are so many ways of answering that. I'll just pick one and then another observation, if I may. So, in our educated Western model, we put all our emphasis on our brain and our intellectual knowing, and we often do that at the expense of our inner knowing of what is true and what is right. And we are encouraged to do that. If the letter of the law says it's okay, then it must be okay. But we know at some level we may pour concrete over our knowing, we may disassociate from our knowing. At some level, what we know when we are living out of kilter with that which we know to be true and right. And if you look at children, that's innate. Children's sense of fairness is so innate. We have this innate knowing from a very early age, and then we are educated out of it so that we can do the things that are expedient to our for a whole level of other motivations. And so for me, is about realizing that our intellects need to be our servants, not our masters. Same goes for
Mm.
economics. It needs to be our servant, not our master. What are we purposing? What how are we programming our intellect? How are we programming our economy? How are we programming our education system? How we program our intellectual knowing? And it's the same for us as individuals as it is for those organizations that help to determine how we live. And for me, we have lost that balance completely between what we know to be true as whole beings and our intellectual truth. It's like asking an abacus to tell us what's right. You can do the
Mm.
numbers, but that isn't it. But going back to closing the distance, that's a really fundamental part to how we work as well. I'm sure you know the work of Peter
Yes, of
Singer.
course.
Why is it that we care so much for those in our close community, and yet we become numb, anesthetized to those who we don't know? And increasingly, with the rise of the far right, certainly in Europe, we're encouraged to other and to dislike and to spot the difference. How do we close that gap so that we come into alignment with the truth, which is that we're all humans, we're all of equal value, and whether we're known or not known, if anyone's child is dying of hunger, that should be of as much concern to me as if a child I know is dying of hunger. And so, how do we close that gap between how we respond to those we know and care about and those who are strangers or others? And that's the business of compassion. It's about closing that gap so that we can live in better alignment with those values that most of us
Mm.
profess to hold dear: caring, equity, kindness, justice.
Well, let's end it there. We've gone 2 minutes over. Thank you so much. I so appreciate the backing and forthing on our calendars and opening the time um, to connect and to close distance, which I hope we've done. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Oh, you're amazing. I'm so frustrated that we don't have longer to talk because I love what you're doing. Maybe we can schedule another time for a coffee, maybe over my summer, your winter, whenever you have
I would
time. It
love
would be
to, and
lovely.
even better, a trip back to the UK is way overdue, and I'd love to grab you and chain you to a coffee table somewhere and talk. Okay,
Fantastic. All the best.
likewise. And thank you so much. Okay, bye.